The first hog broke free of its pen at dawn, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, there were 11 of them rooting through the pecan orchard like the ground itself owed them a debt. Mud sprayed from their snouts. Fallen nuts vanished beneath their trotters. A rooster screamed somewhere near the barn, though no one had time to investigate why. Ruth Calloway stood at the fence line with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching the animals tear through 18 acres of trees her husband had planted a decade before he died, and she did not call the hogs back. She had let them loose herself. The morning was cold enough that her breath showed in front of her, and the frost had not yet burned off the low grass along the fence line. Somewhere behind the house, a dog barked twice and fell silent, as though even the animal sensed something unusual was unfolding. Ruth had not slept the night before, not from doubt, but from the particular restlessness of a woman waiting for a decision she had already made to finally arrive. Behind her, the hired hand named Otis stood with his hat pushed back on his head, mouth slightly open, watching pigs destroy what looked, to any reasonable eye, like the very thing they had all worked 12 months to protect. "You did this on purpose," Otis said. It was not a question. "I did," Ruth said. "Your husband would have shot every one of them hogs before breakfast." "My husband is not the one standing here," Ruth said, and turned back toward the trees, where the animals kept working the soil, and did not stop. That was the morning half the county decided Ruth Calloway had finally lost whatever sense her husband's death had left behind. It would take a full year, and a spring nobody expected, before anyone admitted she might have been right all along. 3 years earlier, when Daniel Calloway was buried on the hill behind the smokehouse, the orchard he left behind was already sick and nobody wanted to say the word out loud. The trees drank water and gave back less each season. Scab crept along the bark. The nuts that did come in were small and bitter, and half the crop rotted where it fell because nobody could explain why the soil beneath the trees had gone hard and gray, the way old bread goes hard, the way a thing goes when whatever fed it has stopped feeding it. Daniel had never much believed in asking why. He believed in working harder, and when the orchard failed to answer that kind of belief, he simply worked harder still, until the winter he caught a fever nobody in 3 counties could break, and Ruth buried him with dirt still under his fingernails from trying to save trees that were, by then, already past saving in the way he understood saving. The neighbors who came to the burial spoke kindly of Daniel, the way neighbors do at any burial, though more than one of them privately wondered aloud, walking back to their wagons afterward, what would become of 18 acres of failing trees now that the only man who understood them, or believed he did, was gone. Nobody asked Ruth directly what she intended to do. Most simply assumed she would sell, the way most widows in that county eventually sold, and move back to live near her own family, and the orchard would pass to whichever neighbor had cash enough to buy land nobody else particularly wanted. Ruth heard some of this whispering directly, and more of it secondhand, in the weeks following the burial, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that it steadied her resolve rather than shook it. Ruth was 26 the year she took the orchard over alone. She had grown up on a farm 2 counties over, the daughter of a man who kept careful ledgers and believed, unlike most men she had known since, that a problem observed honestly was already half solved. She carried that belief with her into her marriage, though Daniel had rarely made room for it, being a man who preferred instinct to arithmetic, and preferred, most of all, not to be questioned by his wife in front of other men. With Daniel gone, there was no one left to mind what she questioned. She spent that first winter walking the orchard rows with a notebook she kept tucked inside her coat, writing down things that seemed, to the men who noticed her doing it, like a woman filling time she should have spent grieving properly. She wrote down which trees dropped their leaves first. She wrote down where the ground stayed wet longest after rain and where it dried hard and cracked within a day. She dug, more than once, down through the topsoil with her bare hands, feeling for whatever lived down there, and found, mostly, nothing. No worms. No grubs. No black, crumbling richness a healthy orchard floor ought to have. Just pale, packed dirt that had, over 10 years of falling nuts and rotting husks nobody ever cleared away, gone stale in a way that looked, from a distance, like ordinary ground, and felt, up close, like something already dead. She walked those rows most mornings before the frost had fully lifted, her boots leaving prints in ground too hard to properly hold them, and she came to know each tree the way a person comes to know a face they study long enough. The old ones near the well had a certain slump to their branches that the younger ones near the fence line did not share. The trees closest to where Daniel had once piled the fall's husks each year, meaning to spread them and never quite finding the time, were the sickest of all, as though the very thing meant to feed them had instead been slowly smothering them all along. She began, that first winter, to suspect the answer lay less in what the trees lacked and more in what had been allowed to simply accumulate, unmoved and unbroken down, for far too many seasons in a row. "Ground's tired," she said one evening to her father, who had ridden over from his own farm to see how she was managing. He did not answer right away. He was a quiet man, careful with his words the way he was careful with his ledgers, and he let her finish before he spoke at all. "Tired how?" he said finally. "No life in it. No worms. Nothing breaking down what falls. Just husks piling up on top of hard ground, season after season, and the roots choking on their own leavings." Her father crouched down at the base of a tree and pressed his palm flat against the dirt the way a doctor might press a palm against a fevered forehead. He was quiet a long while. "You've seen something the rest of us missed," he said. "Question is whether you can fix a thing everyone else has already decided is past fixing." That question sat with Ruth through the whole of that winter, and it was her father, in the end, who planted the idea that would take another full year to bear anything resembling fruit. He had kept hogs on his own land for 30 years, and he mentioned, almost as an aside one evening over supper, the way old farmers back in his own father's time used to turn hogs loose beneath orchard trees each fall. Let them root. Let them eat the fallen nuts and rotted fruit that would otherwise breed disease. Let their trotters break up the hardened ground the way no plow built for row crops ever could, and let what came out the other end of a hog feed the soil in ways no man's hand ever managed with a shovel alone. "Nobody around here does that anymore," her father said. "Considered old-fashioned. Considered a mess. But I never forgot it worked." "Why'd it stop, then?" Ruth asked, "if it worked as well as you say." Her father considered the question a long moment before he answered. "Because it looks like a mess while it's happening, and most folks judge a method by how it looks partway through, not by what it leaves behind when it's finished. Hogs rooting through a fine orchard look like ruin to anyone passing on the road. Takes patience to wait past that first ugly look and see what comes after." Ruth wrote it down in her notebook that same night, underlined twice, and did not mention it to another living soul for 6 months. She spent those 6 months doing the arithmetic her father had raised her to do, walking her acres and counting what she had, counting what hogs would cost, counting what damage they might do balanced against what good, and she came, slowly, to a number that frightened her less than the alternative, which was watching the orchard die the same slow way it had been dying since before her husband ever caught his fever. It was late that following summer when she finally raised the idea to Otis, the hired man Daniel had brought on years before and who had stayed out of loyalty to a dead man more than any wage Ruth could offer him. "You want to put hogs in the orchard," Otis repeated, the way a man repeats something he is certain he must have misheard. "I do. Rooting through the trees. Tearing up the ground. Tearing up ground that's already dead, Otis. Ground that's been dying for years and nobody's willing to admit it." Otis took his hat off, wiped his brow though the evening was cool, and put the hat back on slowly. "Your husband would call this foolishness." "My husband," Ruth said, "is not the one who has to watch these trees die a little more every single year. I worked this land alongside him for 6 years, Otis said. "I know what he'd have said, and I know what most men in this county would say too, if you're asking." "I'm not asking what most men would say," Ruth said. "I'm asking what the ground itself is telling me, and it's telling me plainly enough that whatever we've been doing hasn't worked in 3 years running. I'd rather try something that has a history of working somewhere else than keep doing the thing that's failed here already." Otis did not argue further that evening, though he did not agree either, and it was another 2 months before Ruth managed to buy 11 hogs off a farmer 3 days' ride south, using money she had put aside from the last decent harvest before Daniel passed, money she had told no one she was saving. The ride south to fetch the animals took the better part of a week, and Ruth made the trip herself rather than sending Otis alone, wanting to see with her own eyes the orchard the farmer kept, a modest stretch of trees that, unlike her own, showed dark, crumbling soil beneath every row and branches heavy with fruit that put her own thin harvests to shame. She had brought her notebook along for that trip too, filling several pages with observations of a working orchard that had never once been sick in the way her own trees had been sick, comparing every detail she could against what she already knew of her own 18 acres. The farmer, an older man with soil permanently worked into the creases of his hands, walked her through his rows without much ceremony, answering her questions plainly, the way her father might have answered them. He moved slowly between the trees, pointing out details most visitors would never have thought to ask about, the particular way certain rows drained better than others, the specific timing he used each fall to move his own animals from section to section. "Folks think hogs ruin an orchard," the farmer said. "Truth is, an orchard without something working the ground beneath it just slowly starves itself on its own waste. Nature never meant for fallen fruit to just sit there rotting on hard dirt. Something's supposed to come along and finish the job." Ruth rode home with 11 hogs in a hired wagon and a conviction considerably firmer than the one she'd left with, though she said little of what she'd seen to Otis or to anyone else in the county, preferring to let the animals themselves make whatever case needed making. The wagon ride back took nearly as long as the ride south had, the hogs restless and loud for the first 2 days before finally settling into an uneasy quiet, and Ruth spent those long hours turning over everything the southern farmer had told her, testing it against her own notebook, against her own 3 years of careful observation, until by the time she reached her own gate again she had convinced herself, thoroughly and without reservation, that whatever came next was worth whatever the county would say about it. Word travels fast in small counties, and word of Ruth Calloway's hogs traveled faster than most. By the time the animals arrived, half the town already knew, and most of the town already had an opinion. Henry Boone ran the general store in town, a position that had made him, over 20 years, into something like the county's unofficial judge of any decision that seemed to threaten the natural order of things. He said what he thought to anyone who would listen, and plenty listened, because Henry Boone had never once, in living memory, been shy about his opinions. "Woman's going to root out every tree that husband of hers planted," Henry said to a gathering of men outside his store the week the hogs arrived. "Pigs don't know the difference between a weed and a good crop. They'll tear that orchard down to bare dirt by autumn, and then where will she be? Alone, and broke, and still a widow, only now a widow with nothing left to sell." The laughter that followed him was not unkind exactly, the way laughter rarely feels unkind to the men doing the laughing, though it landed differently on the woman it was about. Ruth heard the substance of it secondhand, from Otis, who did not enjoy repeating it but felt she deserved to know what she was up against. "Let them laugh," Ruth said. "Laughing costs them nothing. It'll cost me a season, one way or the other, and I'd rather spend that season finding out for myself than spend it worrying what Henry Boone thinks of my dirt." The teasing did not stop at Henry's store. It followed her, in smaller ways, through the rest of that summer, in the careful, sideways glances of women at church who had once brought her supper after Daniel's burial and now seemed uncertain whether sympathy or amusement was the more appropriate response to a widow turning pigs loose in her own orchard. A boy delivering feed to her gate once asked, without much malice, whether it was true she talked to her hogs the way some folks talk to horses, and Ruth answered him plainly enough that he rode off looking more confused than satisfied. Even the preacher, a mild man who rarely commented on anything beyond Scripture, found occasion one Sunday to mention, in a sermon ostensibly about patience, that some folks in the congregation were testing the Lord's patience along with their neighbors by trying methods no one had seen tried in this county in living memory, a remark that drew several knowing glances toward the pew where Ruth sat with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. She did not let any of it slow her hand. She had buried a husband already, and she had learned, in the burying, that grief and gossip both eventually ran their course if a person simply refused to feed either one more attention than it was due. The morning the hogs broke loose into the orchard, that was the day the laughter reached its peak, because it was one thing to buy 11 hogs and quite another to actually turn them loose among the very trees everyone assumed she was trying to save. But Ruth had read the ground herself, dug her hands into it herself, counted the worms that weren't there herself, and she trusted her own observation over every man's certainty, including, in the end, over her own dead husband's certainty, which was the hardest kind to set aside. The first weeks were, by any outward measure, exactly as bad as Henry Boone predicted. The hogs tore through fallen nuts and rotted husks with an appetite that seemed, at first glance, indistinguishable from destruction. Mud pooled where dry ground had been. A few low branches snapped where hogs pressed too heavily against young trunks, and Otis came to her more than once with his jaw tight, reporting damage he clearly believed confirmed every warning he'd offered before the animals arrived. "Half the seedlings near the creek line are trampled," Otis said one evening, not unkindly, but plainly. "I counted 6 this morning alone." "I know," Ruth said. "I walked it myself before you did." "And you're not worried?" "I'm worried about plenty," Ruth said. "But I'm not worried about 6 seedlings if what's underneath the ground starts breathing again. Seedlings I can replant. Dead soil I cannot." The weeks that followed tested her resolve more than she admitted to anyone, including herself. There were mornings she walked out to the orchard and saw nothing but mud and wreckage where trees had stood tall the autumn before, and she had to remind herself, standing at the fence with her hands cold in her coat pockets, that her father's own words about the ugly middle of things applied exactly to what she was witnessing now. A thing worth doing rarely looked finished halfway through, and the hogs were, by her own accounting, not even halfway through their work yet. She kept her notebook through that whole first autumn, writing down what she saw the way her father had taught her to write down what she saw rather than what she hoped for. She wrote down where the hogs rooted deepest. She wrote down where the ground, once hard as a dry riverbed, had gone soft and dark within weeks of the animals working it over. She noted, too, the smell of the turned earth, richer and darker than anything the orchard had produced in years, a smell she recognized from her father's own land though she had never once caught it drifting up from her husband's trees before. She dug her hands into that softened dirt one gray October afternoon and found, for the first time in 3 years, the unmistakable wriggle of an earthworm curling around her finger, and she sat back on her heels in the mud and did not move for a long moment, because she understood, in that instant, exactly what she was looking at. One worm was not proof of anything a skeptical man would accept. But one worm, where 3 years running there had been none at all, was proof enough for the person who had spent every one of those 3 years looking. She did not tell Henry Boone about the worm. She did not tell anyone in town at all. She simply kept walking her rows, kept writing in her notebook, and let the winter come without offering a single word of explanation to the men who had already decided, months before, exactly how her story was going to end. Winter that year was harsh, the kind that kept most farms quiet and most conversation confined to kitchens and general stores rather than open fields, and it was during that quiet that Ruth's mother-in-law, a steady, watchful woman named Constance who had never much involved herself in the running of the orchard while her son was alive, began paying closer attention than anyone realized. Constance had buried her own husband years before Daniel ever caught his fever, and she understood, in a way few others in the family did, exactly what it cost a woman to keep land running alone while an entire county waited to see her fail. She did not offer opinions loudly the way Henry Boone did. She offered them quietly, in small moments, in ways that shifted the balance of things without anyone quite noticing until afterward. She had come to stay with Ruth for the worst stretch of that winter, ostensibly to help with the mending and the canning, though Ruth suspected, without ever saying so aloud, that Constance had come mostly to watch, the way an older woman watches a younger one she has decided, quietly, to believe in. It was Constance who first suggested, over a supper the two women shared alone that winter, that Ruth stop hiding her notebook. "You've been keeping records nobody's seen," Constance said. "Why?" "Because nobody would believe them yet," Ruth said. "Not with the ground still looking the way it looks in winter. Ground doesn't prove anything until spring shows what it's grown." "Then let spring speak for itself," Constance said. "But when it does, you'd best have those records ready, because a woman's word alone won't convince men like Henry Boone of anything. Numbers might. Numbers, and what grows out of the ground where he swore nothing ever would again." "You never said much, all these months," Ruth said. "I wondered if you thought me foolish too." Constance set down her cup slowly, considering the question with the same careful weight she gave most things. "I buried my own husband on land everyone told me I couldn't keep running alone," she said. "I kept it running 12 years past the day they buried him, and not one of those men who doubted me ever once apologized for the doubting. They simply stopped mentioning it, once the harvests kept coming. That's the only apology you'll likely get too, Ruth." Silence, where there used to be laughter. Learn to take that as the victory it is, because it's the only kind this county tends to offer. Ruth took her mother-in-law's advice seriously, the way she took most advice that came without demanding anything of her in return, and she spent that winter organizing 3 years of notes into something resembling a ledger her own father would have recognized and approved of. Rows of trees, numbered. Soil conditions, noted month by month. Nut yields from years before the hogs, set beside what she hoped, though did not yet know, the coming spring might show. Spring arrived early that year, warm rains coming through in the second week of March, and Ruth walked her orchard the first clear morning after the thaw with her heart lodged somewhere near her throat, because whatever the ground had to say this year, it was going to say it plainly, one way or the other. What she found stopped her cold in the third row from the creek. The trees there, the same trees that had dropped small, bitter nuts for 3 straight years, the same trees Daniel had worked himself into a fever trying to save, were budding thicker and greener than she had seen since before her husband ever fell sick. She walked the full length of every row that morning, counting buds the way she had once counted worms, and by the time she reached the far fence line, her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the specific, disbelieving joy of watching a dead thing come back to life in front of her. She sat down for a long while on an overturned crate near the fence, letting the morning sun warm her face, and allowed herself, for the first time in 3 years, to think of Daniel without the accompanying weight of failure that had colored every thought of him since his burial. He had loved these trees in the only way he knew how, through sheer stubborn effort, and it seemed to her, sitting there in the new spring light, that he would have wanted the trees saved more than he would have wanted to be the one who saved them, though she suspected it would have taken him considerably longer than 3 years to admit that himself. She did not tell Henry Boone directly. She did not need to. Word of a widow's orchard budding out thick and green after a winter everyone assumed had finished what 3 years of decline had started traveled through the county faster than any hog ever had, and it was Henry Boone himself, 3 weeks later, who rode out to her fence line unannounced, hat in hand, wearing an expression Ruth had never once seen on him before. "Heard your trees are budding stronger than they have in years," Henry said, standing awkwardly at the gate the way a man stands when he has come to say something he has not yet decided how to phrase. "They are," Ruth said. "I said some things, back when you bought those hogs." "You did." Henry turned his hat over once in his hands. "I'd like to see the ledger, if you're willing to show it. Numbers, not just green leaves. I run a store off numbers, Mrs. Calloway. I'd trust numbers over gossip any day, mine included." Ruth studied him a long moment before she answered, weighing whether the invitation was genuine or simply another form of doubt dressed up more politely than the first. She decided, in the end, that it did not matter which it was. The numbers would speak for themselves either way. "Come up to the house," she said. "I'll show you everything." She spread 3 years of records across her kitchen table that afternoon, soil notes beside yield counts, worm counts beside nut weights, and Henry Boone sat with his spectacles pushed low on his nose, tracing columns with one thick finger, saying very little, though his silence, by the end of an hour, had turned into something considerably more thoughtful than the laughter he'd offered outside his store the autumn before. He asked about specific rows, cross-checking her numbers against what he could see through her kitchen window, the trees nearest the creek visibly heavier with new growth than the ones farther out where the hogs had rooted less thoroughly. He asked how she'd decided how many hogs to buy, and how she'd known when to move them from one section of the orchard to the next, and Ruth answered each question the same plain way she answered everything, without embellishment, without asking him to simply take her word for any of it. "I'll admit," he said finally, "I did not expect to be sitting at this table today." "Neither did I," Ruth said. "Not a year ago." "What made you certain enough to try it, with everyone telling you otherwise?" Ruth considered the question seriously before she answered. "I wasn't certain," she said. "I was observant. There's a difference, Mr. Boone, though most folks around here treat them as the same thing. I didn't know the hogs would work. I knew the ground was dying, and I knew doing nothing certainly wouldn't save it. Between a method with some history behind it and a method of simply hoping harder, I chose the one with history. Most folks in this county would rather hope harder," Henry said, "than admit they might be wrong about something they've believed their whole lives. Most folks in this county, Ruth said, have never had to bury a husband and watch his life's work die a little more every season with no one left to blame but themselves if they didn't try something different. Henry left that afternoon a considerably quieter man than he'd arrived, and though he never publicly apologized for what he'd said outside his store, he did, within the month, begin recommending Ruth's methods to other farmers who came through his door asking after tired ground and thin harvests, which was, in its own way, apology enough for a man built the way Henry Boone was built. The harvest that autumn came in heavier than any since before Daniel's death, nuts fuller and sweeter than the orchard had produced in years, and word of it spread through 3 counties by the time the last of the crop was in. Farmers who had laughed at Ruth Calloway's hogs the year before began asking, quietly, at first through neighbors and eventually in person, whether the method might work for their own tired ground. She stood at her own gate more than once that autumn, speaking to men who had ridden considerable distances specifically to ask her questions they would never have thought to ask a widow the year before, and she noticed, with a satisfaction she kept mostly to herself, that not one of them mentioned the laughter from the previous autumn, as though the whole county had collectively agreed to let that particular memory quietly settle into the same ground the worms had come back to. Ruth answered every question plainly, sharing what she'd learned without asking anything in return, because she had come to believe, over that long year of watching worms return to dead soil, that knowledge kept locked away helped no one, least of all the person holding it. She wrote out, more than once, simple instructions for men who could not stay long enough to hear the full explanation: how many hogs per acre, how long to leave them before moving them along, what signs in the soil meant the ground was finally breathing again. Otis, who had doubted the plan as loudly as anyone in those first uncertain weeks, became, by that second harvest, something closer to an advocate himself, explaining to other hired hands at the feed store exactly what he had watched happen across 3 seasons, speaking of it now the way a man speaks of something he witnessed rather than something he merely tolerated. He had, in his own quiet way, become something of a convert himself, the kind who defends a change most fiercely once he has finally stopped resisting it. Never seen a woman prove a whole county wrong quite so quietly, Otis said to Ruth one evening, watching the last of the harvest wagons roll toward town. Didn't think it could be done without shouting. Shouting never once changed anyone's mind that I've seen, Ruth said. Numbers do. Given enough time. It was 2 years later, with the orchard fully recovered and producing better than it ever had under Daniel's care, that a distant cousin of Ruth's, a young woman named Josephine who had come to help during a particularly demanding harvest season, approached her one evening with an idea of her own, an idea about rotating a small flock of geese through the rows between hog seasons, to handle the insects hogs left untouched. "Everyone will think I've lost my mind," Josephine said, half laughing, half serious, watching Ruth's face carefully for a reaction. Ruth studied her young cousin for a long moment, remembering, with a clarity that surprised her, exactly how it had felt to stand at this same fence line 3 years earlier with a notebook full of observations nobody believed and a plan nobody but her own father had taken seriously. "What makes you think the geese would help?" Ruth asked, beyond a feeling that they might. Josephine explained, in careful detail, what she had observed the previous summer: insects thick along the lower branches in sections the hogs never fully cleared, and how geese, back on her own family's land, had always kept such pests down without disturbing the soil the way hogs did. She had, Ruth noted with quiet approval, already begun keeping her own small notebook, though she had not mentioned it until now. "Let them think it," Ruth said. "Write it down first. Watch it close. The ground will tell you soon enough whether you're right, and it won't much care what the rest of the county thinks in the meantime." Josephine's geese arrived the following spring, and though it took the better part of 2 more seasons before anyone besides Ruth believed the idea had merit, the orchard kept producing, kept proving, the same slow, patient way it always had, that the ground beneath a person's feet rarely lies, even when everyone standing on top of it insists otherwise. That was how the county came, eventually, to understand what Ruth Calloway had known from the very first morning she opened those pig pens and let 11 hogs loose among trees everyone assumed she was destroying. Change did not arrive because anyone was convinced by an argument. It arrived because a woman with a notebook and a dead husband's failing orchard chose to trust what the ground itself was willing to show her, one patient season at a time, long after everyone else had stopped looking down at all.